The city of New Orleans doesn't sleep, it sweats. It breathes a humid, jasmine-scented sigh that clings to your skin, a perpetual reminder of the life teeming in its veins. Even at 3 in the morning, the air outside the Orleans Parish Coroner's office is thick with it, a miasma of music, rot, and river water. But inside these walls, the air is different. Here we manufacture our own climate, a sterile, refrigerated reality where the city's vibrant, chaotic pulse is silenced. My name is Arthur Penn, and for the last 12 years this sterilized silence has been my domain. As the sole night shift autopsy technician, I am the custodian of the city's final, quietest moments. Most people imagine a place like this is governed by fear. They picture flickering lights, echoing drips, and the constant, unnerving presence of the dead. They are wrong. This place is governed by order. It is a laboratory, not a haunted house. The only ghosts here are the lingering traces of lives lived, catalogued in neat manila folders, toxicology reports, dental records, police statements. My world is one of stainless steel, fluorescent lights that hum with a steady, monotonous drone, and the pervasive scent of bleach fighting a losing war against the deeper, sweeter smell of mortality. I find comfort in it. The living are a tangled mess of intentions, emotions, and unpredictable impulses. The dead, on the other hand, are an open book. They are puzzles of cause and effect. Aortic dissection, cerebral hemorrhage, kinetic energy transfer from a moving vehicle. It's all just data. My job is to collect that data, to translate the body's silent testimony into the clean, unambiguous language of a coroner's report. It is a sacred, methodical process, and I am its high priest. My shift begins at 10 p.m. The transition is a ritual in itself. I shed the humid skin of the city, changing into my sterile blue scrubs. I review the handover notes from Dave, my day shift counterpart, a man whose weary optimism has always felt alien to me. Then I walk the floor. I check the temperature gauges on the refrigerated storage bay, ensuring they hold their steady 4 degrees Celsius. I inspect the autopsy suites, making sure every instrument is not only clean, but in its precise, designated place on the rolling trays. Forceps here, bone saws there, scalpels arranged by blade size. This is my kingdom, and its primary law is a place for everything, and everything in its place. This order isn't just a professional quirk, it's a mental bulwark against the chaos that brings my silent patients to me. Tonight began with a routine case, a sad coda to a night of revelry. A tourist from Ohio, mid-40s, had a fatal argument with a wrought iron balcony on Bourbon Street. Too much hurricane cocktail, not enough situational awareness. The paperwork called it accidental death by fall, a polite way of describing the brutal physics of gravity. I did the preliminary work, photographing the extensive trauma, taking fluid samples, noting the identifying marks. It was straightforward, impersonal work. When I was finished, I covered him with a fresh sheet, wheeled the gurney down the long, echoing corridor to the storage bay, and slid him into the cold, dark silence of vault number 12. I secured the heavy latch, heard the satisfyingly solid thump as it engaged, made the final entry on my clipboard, and returned to autopsy suite 1. The clock on the wall read 12:48 a.m. The cleanup was the final part of the ritual. I disposed of the bio-waste, wiped down the steel table until it gleamed under the harsh overhead lights, and began sterilizing my instruments. It was during this process that the first thread in the fabric of my orderly reality came loose. My primary incision tray, a specific kidney-shaped dish containing 3 scalpels, a pair of forceps, and surgical scissors, was not where it should have been. I had a crystal-clear eidetic memory of placing it on the wheeled instrument stand next to the autopsy table before I took the body to storage. It was muscle memory, ingrained over thousands of nights. Yet there it was, sitting on the counter next to the deep steel decontamination sink on the other side of the room, a good 20 feet away. I stopped, the hum of the autoclave filling the sudden silence in my mind. For a full minute, I simply stared at it. It was such a small thing, a detail so minor that most people would dismiss it without a second thought. But to me, it was like a master musician hearing a single discordant note in a symphony. It was wrong. My first thought was exhaustion. Had I worked a double shift last week? Was I more tired than I realized? It was plausible. The mind, especially in the deep, solitary hours of the night, can be an unreliable narrator. I walked over, my rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum. I picked up the tray, the metal cool against my fingertips, and placed it back on the instrument stand. The sharp clink of metal on metal seemed unnaturally loud. I took a deep breath, the scent of antiseptic filling my lungs, and forced the incident from my mind. It was a mistake, my mistake. An hour passed. The paperwork was piling up, a welcome distraction of bureaucratic certainty. I was in my small, glass-walled office, a fishbowl from which I can observe the entire autopsy floor. I was typing up my report on the Ohio tourist when a flicker of movement, or rather a change in the static landscape, drew my eye. I looked up, my gaze sweeping across the empty suites. Everything was as it should be. The tables were empty, the floors were clean, the equipment was still. And yet, something was wrong. My eyes settled on Bay 3. On the gurney lay the body of an unidentified elderly woman, a Jane Doe we'd received 2 days ago. She'd been found in her apartment. No family, no friends to claim her. I had prepped her for storage myself at the beginning of my shift, covering her frail form with a crisp white sheet. The protocol is simple. The sheet drapes over the body, covering everything. But that wasn't how it looked now. The top portion of the sheet, the part covering her chest and shoulders, had been folded back on itself. It wasn't a messy, accidental fold. It was a perfect, deliberate rectangle, the crease as sharp as if it had been ironed. It looked for all the world like the turn-down service in a 5-star hotel. The gentle hum of my computer fan suddenly sounded like a roar. This was not a misplaced tray. This was not a lapse in my own memory. I had not done that. It was an alteration. An action had taken place in that room while I was in my office. The blood drained from my face. My mind, desperate for purchase, scrambled for the most logical explanation. A prank. It had to be Dave. He was the only other person with regular access. He must have a key, stayed late after his shift, and was hiding somewhere, trying to get a rise out of the unflappable night shifter. The idea was infuriating. A gross breach of professional conduct in a place that demanded solemnity, but it was a human explanation. It was sane, and I clung to it like a drowning man to a splinter of wood. "All right, Dave, you've had your laugh," I called out, my voice startlingly thin in the cavernous space. "Very funny, you can come out." The silence that answered was absolute. It pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. No scuffling footsteps, no suppressed laughter. Just the endless, monotonous hum of the coolers, a sound that suddenly felt less like a background noise and more like a presence. I pushed back my chair, its legs scraping loudly against the floor, and walked out of my office. The air in the suite felt colder than usual. I approached the gurney in Bay 3, my footsteps the only sound. I stood over the body, staring down at the impossibly neat fold. It was an act of precision, of almost tender care. My skin crawled. This felt profoundly intimate and deeply transgressive. With a hand that shook almost imperceptibly, I reached down and pulled the sheet back up, covering the woman's still form completely. My knuckles brushed against the fabric, and through it the icy, unyielding cold of the flesh beneath. Retreating to my office, I felt a tremor of fear I hadn't experienced in years. The orderly walls of my reality were beginning to crumble. I needed proof. I needed an objective witness. The security cameras. They were old, the feed grainy and monochromatic, but they were my only hope for a rational explanation. I pulled up the system on my desktop computer, the dated software slow to load. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic trapped bird. First the scalpel tray. I found the approximate timestamp and began to scrub through the footage from the camera covering Suite 1. I watched the ghostly black and white version of myself wheel the tourist out of the room. I watched myself return, walk over to the instrument stand and begin my cleanup. Everything was normal. Then at the precise moment between me turning my back to the stand and turning back again, a window of perhaps 3 seconds, the feed dissolved. It wasn't a cut or a skip. The image collapsed into a furious blizzard of white and grey static, accompanied by a sharp, deafening crackle from my computer's cheap speakers. It lasted no more than a second, maybe 2. And when the picture resolved, clear and steady again, the tray of instruments was sitting silently by the sink. My stomach twisted into a cold knot. A power surge? A signal interruption? In a building with its own backup generators, the timing was too coincidental to be an accident. It was surgical. It was an electronic blind spot, perfectly placed. A growing sense of dread began to suffocate me. With trembling fingers, I navigated the timeline forward to the incident with the folded sheet. I switched the feed to the camera, overlooking Bay 3. I watched myself cover the Jane Doe and walk back to my office. For the next hour, the image was as still as a photograph. The gurney, the sheet, the shadows on the floor, all were motionless. And then it happened again. Without warning, the screen erupted into the same chaotic static, the same violent pop blasting from the speakers. This time it was shorter, a mere half-second flash of digital noise. But when the image returned, the deed was done. The sheet was folded. I shoved myself away from the desk, my chair rolling back and hitting the wall with a loud thud. I couldn't breathe. My carefully constructed reality, built on logic, procedure, and the predictable nature of the physical world, had been utterly shattered. This was not a prank. This was not a malfunction. The technology, my last bastion of objective truth, was either complicit or was being actively censored. Something was happening in my morgue, something that operated in the flashes of static, in the blind spots of both my perception and my cameras, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone with it. The rest of the night was a long, slow torture. I abandoned my paperwork. I turned off the lights in my office and sat in the dark, my eyes glued to the live feeds on my monitor, willing something to happen, yet praying it wouldn't. Every shadow seemed to lengthen and twist. Every familiar sound of the old building settling became a footstep, a whisper, but the morgue remained silent and still. When Dave finally arrived at 7 a.m., his cheerful, "Morning, Artie," made me flinch. I looked at him, at his normal coffee-stained shirt and his tired, mundane expression, and I saw a man from a different world, a world where things made sense. He asked if the night had been quiet. I could only manage a nod, the words trapped in my throat. How could I explain? How could I articulate a fear that had no name, no shape, no rational origin? I came in early for my next shift, my body thrumming with a mixture of dread and a desperate need for answers. The hours of daylight had done little to dispel the chilling certainty of the previous night. I walked the corridors not as a technician, but as an intruder in my own territory. I checked every vault, every sheet, every tray. Everything was in its proper place. A small traitorous part of me hoped I had imagined it all, that I was succumbing to the pressure of a grim and lonely job. At 10:17 p.m., the chime of the receiving bay door cut through the silence. The paramedics. They were bringing in a new arrival, a John Doe. The report was scant, found by shrimpers in the bayou south of Jean Lafitte, caught in their nets. They wheeled him in on a gurney, a standard black body bag, zipped tight. The first thing I noticed was the lack of smell. Bodies from the water, especially the warm, brackish water of the Louisiana swamps, have a potent, unforgettable odor of decay and marsh gas. This one had none. I helped the paramedics transfer him to one of my tables. "He's in weirdly good shape, man," one of them said, peeling off his gloves. "Looks like he just took a bath." He was right. As I unzipped the bag, I felt a prickle of cold unease. The man's skin was pale and waxy, but showed almost no sign of decomposition or predation. There was no bloating, no discoloration. His features were placid, serene, his eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. He was a blank slate, a man without a story. I began the intake process, the familiar ritual, a flimsy shield against the growing strangeness of the situation. I photographed his face, fingerprinted his cold, stiff hands, and catalogued the few distinguishing marks he had. All the while, I felt an almost tangible pressure in the air around him, like the low hum of electricity before a lightning strike. I finished my preliminary work and wheeled him toward the storage bay, placing him in Vault 7. I pushed the slab in, swung the heavy door shut, and with deliberate, focused attention, I pushed the latch handle down until I heard and felt the solid, definitive thump-click of the mechanism engaging. I even pulled on it twice to be certain. It was locked. I was in the supply closet at the far end of the hall, taking inventory of formaldehyde solution, when I heard it. A soft, single, metallic sound. A click. It wasn't loud, but in the profound silence of the morgue, it was as clear as a gunshot. It was the sound of a vault latch. My blood turned to ice. I held my breath, straining to listen, my ears ringing in the silence that followed. Nothing. Slowly, deliberately, I put the bottle down and walked out of the closet. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I moved down the long tiled corridor, my soft-soled shoes making no sound. The rows of stainless steel doors reflected the fluorescent lights in long distorted lines. As I approached the main section of the bay, I saw it. The door to Vault 7 was no longer perfectly flush. It was ajar by less than an inch, a vertical sliver of absolute darkness against the brushed steel. My mind screamed at me. You didn't lock it properly. You were distracted. You made a mistake. But I knew with a certainty that defied all reason that I hadn't. I crept forward, my body acting on some morbid autopilot. I reached the door, my hand trembling so badly I could barely grasp the handle. I braced myself, expecting to find the vault empty, the body gone. I pulled the heavy door open. He was still there. The sheet-covered form was lying on the slab, unmoving. A wave of dizzying relief washed over me, so potent it made my knees weak. I almost laughed. It was just a faulty latch. I was losing my mind, seeing patterns in shadows, but then my eyes adjusted to the dim light inside the vault, and I saw it. The detail. The subtle, impossible change. When I had placed him inside, his head was turned slightly to his left shoulder, the natural position gravity had given it. Now it was perfectly centered on the slab. His jaw was aligned with his sternum. His unseen face was pointed directly, squarely at the dark ceiling of his frozen chamber. It wasn't a slump. It wasn't a shift from gases. Rigor mortis had locked him into position hours ago. This was a movement, a quiet, deliberate, and utterly impossible repositioning. I stood there, frozen, the cold air from the vault washing over me. The humming of the compressors seemed to swell, filling my head with a droning, hypnotic buzz. In that moment, standing before the subtly altered corpse, the last vestiges of my rational, orderly world dissolved into nothing. This wasn't a ghost story. This wasn't a prank. This was something else. The rules of life and death, the fundamental laws of physics that had governed my entire existence, were being rewritten in the cold, silent theater of my morgue. And the performance had only just begun. My name is Arthur Penn, and my job is no longer to catalogue the end of stories. It is to bear witness to the beginning of a new one. I don't know where this is going, but the dead are leaving me clues. If you want to help me decipher them, if you want to understand what is waking up in the New Orleans night, then subscribe to this channel and activate your notifications. The silence is about to be broken, and you won't want to miss what it has to say. The boundary between the known and the impossible is not a wall, it is a razor's edge. And for the rest of that night, I walked it. After shutting the vault door on the placid, repositioned face of the John Doe, I did not panic. The initial shock, that freezing wave of existential terror, receded, and in its place settled something far colder and more durable. A crystalline, absolute resolve. The primal fear was still there, a low, thrumming hum beneath the floor of my consciousness. But my professional instincts, the part of me that sees a puzzle and is compelled to solve it, took command. I was no longer just a technician or a witness. I was an investigator. The single overriding question that eclipsed all others was not if this was happening, but how. What were the rules of this new, broken reality? I spent the remainder of my shift in a state of hyper-focused activity. I abandoned all my routine duties. The paperwork, the cleaning, the preparations for the following day, it all seemed laughably trivial. My morgue had become a laboratory for a new and terrible science, and I was its sole researcher. I went back to my office and pulled up the security archives again. I re-watched the moments of static, the digital seizures that concealed the impossible movements. I recorded the exact timestamps, the duration of the interference, the specific cameras affected. I created a new file on my computer, a digital logbook I named Anomalous Phenomena. I documented everything: the misplaced scalpel tray, the folded sheet, the ajar vault, the repositioned head of the John Doe. I wrote with the detached clinical precision of an autopsy report, stripping the events of their emotional weight and reducing them to pure data. This was my defense mechanism, my way of imposing order on the encroaching chaos. Before I left that morning, as the first gray light of dawn began to dilute the oppressive New Orleans darkness, I made a decision. I could not trust the building's systems. The cameras were compromised, their testimony unreliable. If I was to gather real evidence, I would need my own instruments, my own impartial observers. My journey home was a blur. I didn't sleep. Instead, I went to an all-night electronics superstore. The garish fluorescent lights and upbeat pop music, a jarring contrast to the silent, sterile world I had just left. I walked the aisles like a man preparing for an expedition into an undiscovered country. I used my credit card to purchase 3 small, high-definition, motion-activated cameras, the kind used for home security or wildlife observation. I also bought several digital audio recorders with high-sensitivity microphones. These would be my eyes and ears, unblinking and incorruptible. That evening, I arrived for my shift 2 hours early, my bag heavy with my new equipment. I moved with a covert sense of purpose, a spy in my own workplace. I placed the first camera in my office, giving it a panoramic view of the main autopsy suites. The second I positioned discreetly on a high shelf in the storage bay corridor, its wide-angle lens covering most of the vault doors. The third, and most critical, I managed to affix inside refrigeration vault 7 itself, using a magnetic clip to attach it to the ceiling. It was aimed directly at the John Doe. The cold in the vault was intense, and I wasn't sure the battery would last, but I had to try. I placed the audio recorders in strategic locations, one in the main suite, one in the corridor, and one in the ventilation shaft, hoping to capture any sound that the thick walls might otherwise muffle. My morgue was now under my own surveillance. The first few nights of my investigation were an exercise in maddening subtlety. I would retrieve my devices in the morning and spend hours of my own time sifting through the footage and audio files, my eyes burning, my ears straining for the slightest deviation from the norm. For 2 nights, there was nothing. The silent occupants of my morgue remained perfectly still. The audio was a monotonous landscape of humming compressors and the distant rumble of the city. A sliver of doubt began to creep in. Had I imagined it? Was this elaborate setup just a monument to my own fracturing sanity? Then on the 3rd night, I captured something. On the camera inside Vault 7, at 3:33 a.m., the John Doe's left hand, which had been resting palm down on the slab, twitched. It was a minuscule movement, a clenching of the fingers so slight that I had to watch the footage 20 times to be sure I wasn't seeing things. It was followed by a single, sharp click on the audio recorder in the hallway. On the 4th night, the Jane Doe in Bay 3, the woman with the folded sheet shifted her weight. It was an infinitesimal roll, less than a degree of rotation in her torso, but the motion sensor on the camera caught it, logging the event with a precise timestamp. The audio from that night was filled with a low, almost subsonic frequency, a throbbing hum that wasn't present on any of the previous recordings. The movements were real, but they were small, agonizingly slow. This wasn't a violent cinematic haunting. It was a process, a creeping geological unfolding. I began to realize I was witnessing something not just in motion, but in progress. I started a new project. I printed out a floor plan of the morgue and began to map the changes. I used colored pens to mark the initial positions of the bodies and drew arrows to indicate the vectors of their subtle movements. A chilling pattern began to emerge. The shifts were not random. The Jane Doe had rolled slightly to her left. A male victim of a heart attack in Vault 4 had tilted his head a fraction of an inch to the right. The John Doe's hand had clenched. Taken individually, they were meaningless. But when I drew the lines of their movements on the schematic, they all seemed to be orienting themselves like compass needles towards a common point. Vault 7. They were aligning themselves with the man from the bayou. My isolation felt more profound than ever. I was the sole observer of a secret, impossible ballet, and the burden of this knowledge was becoming immense. I knew I couldn't carry it alone. I had to tell someone. I chose my supervisor, Frank Henderson. Frank was a fixture in the coroner's office, a man who had been here for 30 years, a cynical, seen-it-all veteran who was just biding his time until retirement. I thought if anyone would have answers, or at least an open mind, it would be him. I was wrong. I requested a meeting with him, my hands clammy as I clutched a folder containing my logs and a few grainy printouts from my cameras. He met me in his cluttered, dusty office, the walls covered in faded accolades and gruesome photos from old, famous cases. He listened with a look of weary patience as I laid out my findings, my voice sounding thin and shaky even to my own ears. I presented the timestamps, the video stills, the audio anomalies. When I finished, he leaned back in his creaking chair and sighed, a long, weary exhalation that smelled of stale coffee. "Arthur," he began, his tone an infuriating mix of pity and condescension, "you've been on the night shift a long time. This place, the silence, it gets to you if you let it. It has a way of planting things in your head." He tapped his temple. "Back in the 90s, we had a guy, Marty, worked your shift. Good technician. Meticulous, just like you. One day he comes in here swearing the bodies were whispering to him at night, talking about his childhood dog. A week later, he was convinced they were rearranging themselves to spell out messages on the floor. We had to let him go. Found him a nice, quiet job in medical records." I stared at him, my hope shriveling. "Frank, this is different. I have evidence. The cameras—" "Glitches, son," he cut me off, waving a dismissive hand. "This building's 100 years old. The wiring is a nightmare. You get power fluctuations, signal drops, it's normal, you're tired. You're seeing ghosts in the static. My advice? Take a few days off. Go to the lake. Get some sun. Get out of this place for a bit. Reconnect with the living world." He thought I was losing my mind. The realization was a physical blow, leaving me feeling hollowed out and utterly alone. I left his office without another word, the folder of my precious data, feeling like a collection of madman's scribbles. There was no help coming. No one would believe me. But his dismissal had an unintended effect. It extinguished the last flicker of doubt. I was no longer seeking validation from the outside world. This was my mystery to solve, my burden to bear. The paranoia, however, began to set in. Was Frank just a cynical old man, or was his dismissal too quick, too practiced? Did he know something? Was he protecting a secret? Or was he just protecting himself from the ramblings of a man he thought was going insane? The phenomenon, as if sensing my renewed focus, my complete and utter isolation, began to change its tactics. It became personal. One evening I was cataloguing the personal effects of a recent arrival. The procedure is to bag and tag every item found on the body. I opened a small sealed evidence bag containing the effects of a Jane Doe from years ago, a cold case which I was reviewing for a new detective. Inside was a simple, tarnished silver ring with a small, cloudy stone. I was about to place it in her file when I froze. I recognized it. My blood ran cold. It was identical to a ring that had belonged to my wife, Sarah, who had passed away from cancer 5 years prior. A cheap piece of costume jewelry she'd bought at a street market on our honeymoon, a piece she had been buried with. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my throat. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. A cruel, impossibly specific coincidence. I spent the next hour frantically searching the database, pulling up the file for my wife's interment. The funeral home's inventory list was clear. One silver ring with a clear stone. It was with her. So what was this? I left the ring on my desk, unable to touch it. Later that night, while reviewing footage, I saw it, a blur of movement near my office door. I rewound, slowing the video down frame by frame. In the 2-second burst of static that occurred at 1:12 a.m., the ring, which I had left on the corner of my desk, was moved. When the image cleared, it was sitting directly on top of the small framed photograph of Sarah I kept by my monitor. It was a message, a statement. "We know you. We know what you love. We know what you've lost." The psychological assault escalated. The indistinct sounds on my audio recorders began to take shape. The low hum I'd been detecting started to resolve into something that sounded vaguely like whispers, just on the edge of perception. I spent hours with headphones on, amplifying the gain, trying to decipher the sounds. They were like snippets of conversation from a distant room, tantalizingly close to being intelligible. Then one night it happened. I was in the main suite, cleaning an instrument, my mind a million miles away, and I heard it. Not through a recorder, but with my own ears. A soft, clear whisper that seemed to come from all around me. "Arthur." It was Sarah's voice. I dropped the scalpel, which clattered loudly on the tile floor. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body locked. It wasn't just a voice. It was her specific timbre, the gentle, melodic way she always said my name. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice trembling. The only reply was the hum of the coolers. I was shaking, tears welling in my eyes. It was a hallucination. It had to be. Grief, stress, solitude. A potent cocktail for a fracturing mind. But it had felt so real. It happened again the next night, this time from deeper within the morgue. I was in the storage corridor, checking my camera, when the voice echoed softly from the far end of the hall. "Arthur, I'm so cold." It was a phantom, a memory weaponized against me. The entity, the intelligence in this place, was no longer just moving the dead. It was animating my own grief, using my most sacred memories as a tool of psychological warfare. My obsession was now total. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. My life outside these walls ceased to exist. My apartment became a data analysis center, the walls covered with my floor plans, timelines, and audio spectrograms. I delved into the coroner's office archives, digging through decades of dusty, forgotten records. I was looking for precedents, for any hint that this had happened before. I found it, buried in a box of administrative reports from 1983. A series of memos detailing unexplained electrical malfunctions, primarily affecting the security and refrigeration systems. It was followed by a string of complaints from the night shift technician of the time, a man named Moreau, about auditory pareidolia and persistent feelings of being observed. The reports culminated in Moreau's abrupt resignation due to acute psychological distress. But the most chilling discovery was in the intake logs for that same period. A week before Moreau's complaints began, the morgue had received a body that was a carbon copy of my John Doe. An unidentified male pulled from the Atchafalaya Basin in a state of anomalous preservation. The file was thin, the case never solved. He was eventually interred in a pauper's grave. It all clicked into place, a horrifying, elegant synthesis. This wasn't a unique event. It was a cycle, a recurring pattern. The morgue itself, perhaps due to its location, its purpose, its constant proximity to the threshold of death, was some kind of resonator, a passive instrument. And these strange bodies, these men from the swamp, were the tuning forks. Their arrival activated the place, starting the process anew. This wasn't a haunting, it was a mechanism. I went back to my schematic on the wall, the web of lines and arrows charting the slow, deliberate movements of the dead. I looked at the cluster of vectors all pointing toward Vault 7. They weren't just orienting themselves toward the John Doe, they were connecting to him. They were forming a network, a circuit. The ordinary dead were the wires, and the man from the bayou, he was the receiver, or perhaps the amplifier. A terrifying thought bloomed in my mind. This whole process, this slow, creeping reorganization of the dead, wasn't the event itself. It was the preparation for an event. The orchestra was still tuning its instruments. The concert was yet to begin. My existence had contracted, shrinking from the wide, sunlit world to the cold, tiled confines of the morgue. The nights were no longer a shift to be worked, but a vigil to be kept. Sleep had become a foreign country I had no passport to visit, replaced by a feverish, caffeine-fueled obsession. My apartment, once a refuge, was now merely an annex to the investigation, its walls a chaotic mural of morgue schematics, timelines, and astronomical charts I'd downloaded from the internet. I was a man living in two worlds simultaneously. The mundane reality of daytime New Orleans, which felt increasingly thin and unreal, and the profound secret reality of the night, where the dead were charting the heavens. The pattern was the key. I knew it. The movements were too deliberate, too coordinated to be random. My floor plan, crisscrossed with the colored lines of their glacial progress, proved they were all orienting toward the John Doe in Vault 7. But this explanation felt incomplete, two-dimensional. It was a projection of a higher truth, like trying to understand a sphere by looking at its shadow, a circle. The force at play here was not merely pulling them across a floor, it felt grander, more architectural. The morgue wasn't just a circuit board, it was a scale model, an orrery of the deceased. The breakthrough came during a moment of profound exhaustion, in that strange liminal hour before dawn when the mind, untethered from logic, makes intuitive leaps. I was staring at my schematic at the arrows pointing inward, and I considered the Z-axis. The bodies weren't all on the same level. The storage bay was a grid 3 levels high. Bay 3 was on the ground level, but Vault 4 was on the second and another, a Mrs. Dubois in Vault 11, was on the top. I was only charting their movement in length and width, not depth. With a surge of adrenaline that banished my fatigue, I went to my computer. It took me hours using a basic 3D architectural program I downloaded to build a digital replica of the storage bay and the main suites. I painstakingly entered the precise coordinates of each body within that space, X for its east-west position, Y for north-south, and Z for its height from the floor. When I rendered the model, it was a cloud of data points suspended in a black, digital void. I began to draw vectors from each body's initial position to its most recently observed one. The lines all converged, as expected, on the coordinates of Vault 7, but that wasn't the revelation. I hid the vectors and simply looked at the points themselves, at the arrangement of the bodies in three-dimensional space. I rotated the model, looking at it from different angles. It was just a scatter of points. Then, on a whim, I began to draw lines between the closest points, connecting the dead as if they were stars in a constellation. A shape began to emerge, a complex geometric lattice of interconnected nodes. It was elegant, alien, and utterly unfamiliar. My heart hammered in my chest. I spent the next night cross-referencing the shape against every known constellation in the northern and southern hemispheres. I scoured astronomical databases, from the familiar figures of the zodiac to the most obscure star groupings catalogued by ancient civilizations. There was no match. Nothing in the celestial sphere visible from Earth resembled the strange angular glyph being drawn by my silent charges. Despair began to set in. It was just a random pattern, a product of my own pattern-seeking, sleep-deprived mind. But the intelligence in this place had already shown me that it was not of my world. Its methods were alien, its voice a weaponized memory. What if its perspective was alien too? I found a piece of advanced open-source software used by astrophysicists, a program that could model the night sky from any hypothetical point in the universe. The learning curve was steep, but my obsession was a powerful teacher. I inputted the 3D coordinates from my morgue model as a fixed constellation. Then I posed a question to the program, a search query of impossible scale. Find a vantage point in the known universe from which the stars in this sector of the sky would align to form this exact pattern. I clicked Run, and the program began to churn through cosmic data, sifting through billions of stars and trillions of cubic light-years of space. I expected it to run for days, or to simply return an error. But after only 93 minutes, the program chimed. A match had been found, a single, unique match. My hand trembled as I clicked on the result. The screen filled with data, but my eyes were drawn to the location. The pattern being drawn in my morgue was not a constellation visible from our solar system, or even from our corner of the Milky Way. It was a perfect one-to-one topographical map of the core stars of a spiral galaxy, designated only by a string of numbers and letters, NGC 7319 in the Hickson Compact Group 92, a galaxy over 300 million light-years away. The dead were not just pointing to the John Doe. They were using him as a focal point to recreate a celestial map of a place so impossibly distant that the light from its stars began its journey when dinosaurs still roamed the Earth. The knowledge was so immense, so forbidden, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. I was a monk in a dark age, stumbling upon a page of quantum physics. I could recognize it as a form of truth, but I could not begin to comprehend its meaning. This new, terrifying understanding was isolating me further from my own species. The world of traffic, commerce, and idle chatter felt like a dream. The true reality was here, in the cold and the silence, where a message of cosmic proportions was being written in the language of decaying flesh. The phenomenon, however, was no longer content to remain a secret between me and the dead. It was beginning to bleed through the cracks to touch the world outside. The first witness was a man named Mr. Abernathy, a funeral director from a small family-run establishment uptown. He was a man of impeccable professionalism and quiet dignity, someone I had dealt with for years. He arrived one night to retrieve the body of Mrs. Dubois, a woman whose family had finally completed the arrangements. When I opened Vault 11, a blast of unusually cold air seemed to rush out, far colder than the standard 4 degrees. Mr. Abernathy, standing beside me, flinched. "Goodness," he murmured, rubbing his arms. "Feels like you've got that one set to deep freeze, Arthur." As I wheeled the gurney out, the lights above us flickered violently for a moment, buzzing loudly before returning to their steady hum. Mr. Abernathy looked up, his brow furrowed. "Old building, I suppose," he said, though he sounded unconvinced. We proceeded to his hearse in silence. As we were transferring the body, he paused, leaning against the side of the vehicle and pressing his fingers to his temples. "Are you all right, Mr. Abernathy?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a strange confusion. "It's the oddest thing," he said, his voice low. "For a moment there, in the corridor, I felt dizzy, and there was this taste, like biting down on aluminum foil, a sort of static charge in my teeth." He shook his head, forcing a weak smile. "Must be my blood pressure, getting old." He paused again, his gaze turning back toward the morgue's entrance. "And this will sound foolish," he continued, almost whispering, "but as you were wheeling her out, I could have sworn I saw one of the other doors, further down the hall, move. Just a tremor, like something on the other side had bumped it." He looked at me, his expression searching, hoping for a rational explanation I could not provide. In that moment, I saw a reflection of myself from weeks ago, a man of logic and routine, confronted by an impossibility, desperately trying to rationalize it. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to unload the terrifying burden of my knowledge onto another living soul. But how could I? "Mr. Abernathy, the dead are building a galactic map, and it's ionizing the air." I would be confirming his fears that he was losing his mind, not alleviating them. "The building's foundation settles," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "And the electrical system is ancient. It plays tricks on you." He nodded, though his eyes told me he wasn't satisfied. He finished his work and drove away, leaving me more alone than ever. But his experience was a critical piece of data. It was proof. The process, whatever it was generating a field, an energy that was beginning to affect the environment and the perceptions of others. It wasn't just in my head, it was real, and it was getting stronger. The escalation I had been dreading arrived 2 nights later. It began not with a sound, but with the opposite. The constant, omnipresent hum of the refrigeration units, the sound that had been the background music of my life for 12 years, suddenly ceased. The silence was not peaceful. It was a deafening, predatory void. It was the silence of a held breath. I was in my office, and the abrupt change was so jarring that I physically jolted, spilling my coffee across my desk. I looked at the power indicator on my monitor. It was green. The lights were on. It wasn't a power failure. The compressors had just stopped. All of them. In unison. I rose from my chair, my body rigid with apprehension. I walked out of my office and into the main suite. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic pounding of my own heart. I started down the long corridor toward the storage bay, my footsteps echoing like hammer blows. I had to check the compressors. I had to see what was wrong, and then I heard it. It was a sound I had only ever heard when I was the one causing it. A soft, precise, metallic snick. It was the sound of a refrigeration vault latch being disengaged. It was followed by another, and another, and another. Snick, snick, snick. From down the corridor, one after another, in a slow, deliberate rhythm, the latches on the heavy steel doors were being opened from the inside. I froze, flattened against the wall, my mind refusing to process what my ears were hearing. Then, in perfect, dreadful synchronicity, came a low groan of metal on metal as every single vault door swung open. They didn't fly open or creak ominously. They opened smoothly, silently, as if pushed by a careful, considerate hand. For a full minute, I did not move. I did not breathe. My mind was a screaming void. Every instinct told me to run, to flee into the New Orleans night, and never look back. But the investigator in me, the part that had to know, was stronger. Slowly, inch by inch, I peered around the corner, my eyes taking in the long corridor of the storage bay. Every door was open, dark rectangular mouths gaping in the sterile white wall, and in the doorways, they stood. Every single occupant of my morgue was on their feet. The man from the Bourbon Street Fall, the elderly Jane Doe, Mrs. Dubois, the heart attack victim. All of them. They were not shambling or groaning like the monsters in movies. They were perfectly still, like a collection of wax figures unveiled for a private exhibition. Their skin was waxy and discolored. Their bodies bore the marks of their demise, but they stood with a quiet, unnerving dignity. They were not a threat. They were a congregation, and they were all facing the same direction. They stood in their doorways, their heads and bodies oriented down the hall, their blank, milky eyes fixed upon the open door of Vault 7. Inside, the John Doe from the bayou remained on his slab, the only one still lying down. He was not their leader. He was their altar, their focal point, their nexus. I was not seeing an army of the undead. I was witnessing a choir assembling for a silent, holy mass. The circuit was complete. The resonator was active. The grand, alien instrument, built of cold steel and colder flesh, was finally in tune. And in the crushing, absolute silence of the morgue, I had the terrifying realization that I was nothing more than a speck of dust in the cathedral, an insignificant witness to a ritual whose purpose was as vast, as ancient, and as utterly indifferent to me as the distant galaxy they were now mirroring. The performance was about to begin. Time ceased to be a river and became a frozen lake. I stood flattened against the corridor wall, a bas-relief of terror carved in flesh, my gaze locked on the silent, standing congregation. My mind, a frantic machine striving to catalogue the impossible, was failing. The sight before me was a categorical error in the grand library of reality. The dead do not stand, they do not wait, they do not watch. Yet this assembly of the deceased stood with a profound and patient stillness, a tableau of quiet reverence. There was no menace in their posture, no threat in their vacant eyes. The horror wasn't in what they might do, but in the simple, irrefutable fact that they were. They existed in a state that my entire understanding of biology, physics, and death insisted could not be. How long I remained there, I cannot say. Seconds stretched into geologic ages. Then, as one, a subtle shift rippled through them. It was a minute, collective relaxation of posture, a sigh of muscles that should have long since decayed, and in the same synchronized, deliberate manner in which they had opened, the heavy steel doors to their vaults began to swing shut. A series of soft, cushioned thuds echoed down the hall as each door sealed, followed by the crisp, mechanical snick of the latches engaging. The final door, belonging to the Jane Doe, closed, and a profound silence fell once more. A moment later, with a low groan that vibrated through the concrete floor, the refrigeration compressors sputtered back to life, their familiar monolithic hum flooding the void. The morgue had reset itself. The system check was complete. I didn't move until the first pale hint of dawn threatened the eastern sky. My paralysis broke, replaced by a convulsive shudder. I stumbled back to my office on legs that felt like hollow reeds. The standing dead were gone, but their image was seared onto the backs of my eyelids. This was no longer a series of subtle, creeping changes. It was a demonstration, a declaration of presence, a calibration of the grand, grotesque instrument they had become. I replayed the footage from my own cameras. The event was perfectly framed by the now familiar bursts of digital static. The screens were clear, then a blizzard of noise, Then the standing congregation was there. Another burst of static and the vaults were sealed again. The phenomenon was not just hiding its work, it was editing the official record, leaving only my fallible human memory as evidence of the true event. My investigation had reached its limit. My data, my charts, my celestial maps, they showed me the intricate choreography of the dead, but they were silent on the soul-crushing why. I was like a primitive man finding a fusion reactor, able to chart its heat and light, but utterly ignorant of the atomic forces at its heart. To understand the purpose, I needed to find a text, a key, a Rosetta Stone, and I knew there was only one place it could be. I had to find what the technician from 1983, Moreau, had left behind. My first step was a second, futile appeal to Frank Henderson. I cornered him the next afternoon, my appearance so haggard and sleep-deprived that he actually recoiled slightly. I didn't mention the standing dead. I knew how that would sound. Instead, I feigned a historical interest. "Frank, I'm doing some research on the office's history. I was reading about a technician from the early 80s, a man named Moreau. The records say he resigned under duress. Do you remember him? Do you know what happened to his personal effects?" Frank's face, usually a mask of weary cynicism, tightened. A flicker of something I couldn't identify, annoyance, fear, passed through his eyes. "That's ancient history, Arthur," he grumbled, avoiding my gaze. "The guy had a nervous breakdown, that's all. His locker was cleared out. Whatever was in it is long gone." He pushed past me, muttering about budget reports. His denial was too swift, his dismissal too absolute. He was lying. He knew something, or at least suspected, and had sealed that knowledge away. That night I became a trespasser. Armed with a set of bolt cutters I'd bought from a hardware store, I made my way down to the sub-basement, a part of the building no one had used for years. It was a crypt of forgotten bureaucracy, filled with towering shelves of decaying file boxes, old, decommissioned equipment shrouded in dusty tarps, and the thick, sweet smell of moldering paper. In the far corner, covered in cobwebs, was a bank of rusted employee lockers, the kind that had been replaced decades ago. Most were empty, their doors hanging open like broken teeth. But one, number 42, was shut tight, a heavy, old-fashioned padlock on its latch. Moreau's name was still faintly visible on a faded paper label. The lock was old and corroded, but the bolt cutters sheared through it with a sharp, percussive snap that echoed through the cavernous basement. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled the locker door open. It protested with a long, agonizing shriek of rusted metal. The inside was mostly empty, save for a thick layer of dust and a single object on the top shelf, a small tin lunchbox, the kind children used to carry. Its surface decorated with a faded, cartoonish illustration of an astronaut planting a flag on a pockmarked moon. It was absurdly, surreally out of place in this tomb of decay. I took the box back to the sterile, brightly lit sanctuary of my office. My hands were shaking as I placed it on my desk. The latches were stiff, but they opened with a puff of stale, contained air. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like yellowed cotton batting, was a single leather-bound journal and 3 audio cassette tapes, their labels handwritten in a spidery, frantic script. I put the first tape into an old cassette player I kept in a drawer. I put on my headphones, took a deep breath and pressed play. The voice that emerged from the hiss and crackle of the aged magnetic tape was thin, academic, and eerily calm. It was Moreau. October 12th, 1983. Log entry 1. My name is Dr. Alistair Moreau. My formal background is in biophysics, but circumstance has led me to this municipal position. I have begun to notice certain energetic inconsistencies within the facility, particularly during the nocturnal hours. The EM fields are fluctuating in ways that defy conventional explanation. I believe the unique material conditions of this place, the constant presence of necrotic tissue, the specific geological underpinnings of the structure, have created a unique resonance chamber. I intend to study this phenomenon. I listened for hours, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. Moreau's initial entries were calm, scientific, and methodical. He chronicled the same events I had witnessed, the subtle movements, the equipment malfunctions, the alignment of the bodies. But he approached it not with fear, but with the detached curiosity of a scientist. He had a theory. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in a new, undiscovered form of energy. He called it necrotic resonance. Then I opened the journal. His handwriting, initially neat and precise, mirrored the calm tone of his early recordings. He had diagrams, equations, calculations that were far beyond my comprehension. He believed that death was not a cessation, but a quantum decoherence, a change of state that released a specific, subtle energy signature. This morgue, for reasons he couldn't fully fathom, acted as a natural amplifier for these signatures. November 3rd, 1983, I read. The arrival of the specimen from the Atchafalaya Basin has changed the equation entirely. Its cellular structure is remarkable. It resists decay in a manner that seems to violate thermodynamic principles. It is not a corpse in the traditional sense. It is a biological capacitor, a catalyst. The other occupants have begun to recalibrate their positions relative to it. They are not moving randomly. They are tuning themselves like iron filings in the presence of a powerful magnet. This is not a collection of individual phenomena. It is the assembly of a single, cohesive apparatus. His words validated my own conclusions, but pushed them into a realm of terrifying scientific plausibility. I put in the second tape. Moreau's voice had changed. The academic detachment was gone, replaced by a strained, urgent whisper. November 21st, 1983. The apparatus, it has a purpose. I've detected a signal. It's not auditory, not electromagnetic in any conventional sense. It is a patterned, repeating resonance, embedded in the very fabric of the background hum. It is profoundly complex. Information. The signal's point of origin is it's not possible. The vectors point outward. Not to a local source, not to a satellite. The math is unambiguous. The source is extragalactic. I don't know if this is a message, a beacon, or just an echo. The apparatus isn't generating the signal. It's receiving it. It's an antenna. A grotesque antenna built of the dead. My own discovery of NGC 7319 flashed in my mind. He had seen it too. He had understood. The final tape was almost unlistenable. Moreau's breathing was ragged, interspersed with long, unnerving silences and what sounded like soft, desperate weeping. His voice was a raw, terrified rasp. December 8th, 1983. It knows I'm here. The signal, it has a parasitic informational quality. It's beginning to affect my own neural pathways. I can hear it even when I'm away from the morgue. A whisper behind the noise of the world. It showed me my mother's face last night, in a reflection, in a puddle. I haven't seen her since I was 9 years old. It's probing me, learning my cognitive architecture, using my memories as a lexicon to try and form a coherent something. It is not malevolent, it is not benevolent. It is simply vast, an intelligence of such scale that it perceives my consciousness as little more than a useful tool. My own experience with Sarah's voice, her ring, it wasn't a personal attack, it was a diagnostic. The system was learning to interface with me. I felt a wave of nausea. The final entries in the journal were nearly illegible, the handwriting a chaotic scrawl that tore through the paper. He had figured out the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle. The purpose of the antenna, the purpose of the receiver. December 15th, 1983. The antenna is complete. The signal is being received, focused to a single point in space-time, this room. But a signal of this nature, this complexity, is just potential. It's a wave of infinite possibilities. It needs an observer. It requires a conscious, intelligent biological mind to collapse the waveform, to process the data, to give the transmission coherent form. Without a processor, it is just noise. It needs a listener. The entire construction, the alignment, the resonance, the amplification, it was all to prepare the signal for a single final component. I turned to the very last page. There was only one sentence, written with such pressure that the pen had ripped through the paper. It was circled several times. It was the culmination of his research, the final soul-destroying truth he had uncovered just before he fled or fell into madness. As I read the words, the hum of the compressors around me seemed to fade, replaced by a ringing in my ears, the whisper of a distant signal finally finding its intended destination. The entire history of the morgue, the cycles of activity, my own investigation, it all snapped into a new, horrific context. I was not the discoverer of this secret. I was its inheritor. I was its objective. The last line read, "The machine isn't built to be watched, it's built to be heard. The living technician is not a witness, he is the receiver." The final sentence of Moreau's journal was not a revelation, it was a verdict. It was the cold clinical diagnosis of a terminal condition I never knew I had. I sat in the sterile bubble of my office, the leather-bound journal open on the desk, the tin lunchbox beside it like a child's coffin. The world outside the glass walls of my office, the gleaming steel tables, the neatly arranged instruments, the silent refrigerated doors, had fundamentally transformed. It was no longer a workspace, it was the intricate living anatomy of a predator, and I was in its belly. I had been inside it for 12 years, meticulously cleaning its teeth and polishing its claws, utterly oblivious to the fact that it was slowly, patiently digesting me. The hum of the compressors, once a monotonous background noise, was now a voice. It was the carrier wave Moreau had described, a deep, resonant frequency that vibrated not in my ears, but directly in the bones of my skull, in the fluid of my spine. It was a language of pure structure, of cosmic grammar, and in the wake of Moreau's discovery, a switch had been flipped in my perception. I was beginning to understand it. I couldn't translate it into words, not yet, but I could feel its intent. It was a process of calibration, of fine-tuning. The apparatus was preparing the signal, and I, the receiver, was being prepared as well. My brain, my consciousness, my very soul was the final vacuum tube in a circuit of incomprehensible scale, and it was beginning to warm up. There was no thought of escape. Where would I run? The signal wasn't confined to these walls. Moreau had heard it miles away. It was now tethered to my consciousness. To flee would be like trying to outrun my own shadow. To destroy my own mind, to follow Moreau's implied path into suicide, felt like a concession, a final pathetic act of allowing the phenomenon to dictate the terms of my end. No. The scientist in me, the part that had driven this obsessive investigation, screamed for one final experiment. If I was a component in a machine, I had a right to see the machine's heart. If I was to be the receiver, I would first confront the transmitter. The source was the John Doe, the catalyst, the man from the bayou. Moreau called him the capacitor. I saw him as the lens, the point through which the vast, diffuse signal from a distant galaxy was being focused into a coherent beam aimed directly at my mind. If I could disrupt that lens, if I could break the focal point, perhaps I could shatter the entire apparatus. It was a desperate, hopeless gambit, like trying to fight a hurricane with a hammer, but it was the only move left on the board. My actions took on a strange, dreamlike quality, a sense of predestination. I rose from my chair, the worn leather groaning in the profound quiet. I walked to the instrument sterilization room, my footsteps unnervingly loud on the tiled floor. My eyes scanned the racks of gleaming tools. My hand reached out, my fingers closing not around a scalpel or forceps, but around the cold, heavy handle of a Stryker bone saw. Its serrated circular blade was designed for the crudest work, bisecting a sternum, amputating a limb. It was a tool of brute force and disassembly. It felt appropriate. Holding the saw at my side, I began the long walk down the corridor toward the storage bay. The journey of 100 feet felt like a pilgrimage across a hostile, alien landscape. The fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz with a new intensity, their white light feeling less like illumination and more like a form of scrutiny. I could feel the resonance in the air, a palpable pressure that made my teeth ache and my hair stand on end. The static charge Mr. Abernathy had felt. It was an ionization of the very atmosphere, the air itself becoming charged by the power coursing through this place. With every step I took towards Vault 7, the pressure intensified. It felt as though I were wading into deep water, the weight of an invisible ocean pressing in on me. The humming grew louder, resolving into a complex tapestry of interwoven frequencies, a choir of cosmic drones. They were singing their silent, mathematical song, and they knew I was coming to interrupt the performance. I reached the door of Vault 7. It looked no different from the others, a slab of indifferent brushed steel, but to my newly awakened senses, it radiated a palpable cold. a vortex of energy that made the air in front of it shimmer almost imperceptibly. It was the heart of the machine. I placed my free hand on the latch. It was colder than ice, the metal seeming to draw the heat directly from my flesh. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the charged air tasting of ozone and ancient dust, and I pulled the handle. The door swung open with a deep, resonant groan. A cloud of vapor, far denser and colder than normal, billowed out, swirling around my feet like a spectral tide. I stepped inside. The interior of the vault was a pocket of absolute stillness. The John Doe lay on his slab, placid and serene, his waxy skin seeming to glow faintly in the dim light. He looked perfect, untouched. Not a corpse, but an idol. The focal point of a prayer whispered across 300 million light-years. I raised the bone saw. Its weight was a comfort, a solid terrestrial reality in this place of impossible physics. I thumbed the activation switch. The silence was shattered by the high-pitched, furious whine of the electric motor, the blade spinning into a silver blur. This was it, the final act of defiance. My finger tightened on the trigger and I lunged toward the slab, aiming for the serene, silent head. I never reached him. The moment the saw's blade came within a foot of the body, the universe broke. The whine of the saw was instantly consumed by a sound that was not a sound. It was the raw, unmediated source code of existence, downloaded directly into my nervous system. My vision dissolved into a maelstrom of pure, white light. The pressure in my skull did not build. It simply ceased to be as the boundaries of my own consciousness were erased. My mind, my identity, my entire sense of self was not a vessel being filled, but a canvas being violently and instantly scraped clean and repainted with an image of terrifying, incomprehensible grandeur. It was not a vision. It was an understanding, a direct, plenary infusion of knowledge. I understood the nature of the entity. It was not a creature, not a being of flesh or energy. It was a pattern, a complex, self-aware mathematical axiom that had woven itself into the fabric of space-time. It didn't travel through the void. It was the void. Its thoughts were not electrical impulses, but the subtle bending of gravity around distant stars. I understood the purpose of the transmission. It was not a message. It was a form of reproduction, an informational virus of cosmic scale, encoding itself onto the quantum state of matter, using the predictable cycle of organic life and death as its preferred medium for replication. Planets rich in life were not cradles of consciousness. They were petri dishes, fertile ground for its propagation. I understood the role of humanity, our myths of gods and demons, our search for meaning, our art, our science, our love, all were just transient, decorative ripples on the surface of a deep biological imperative. We were born to live, to gather complexity, and to die, releasing that stored complexity back into a system we could never perceive. We were not the pinnacle of creation. We were the fuel. Our deaths were the sparks that powered the antenna. I understood the map. The constellation of NGC 7317 wasn't a point of origin. It was a sister node, another successful receiver in a network that spanned galaxies, a web of interconnected, death-fueled choirs singing the same endless structural song. The sum total of this knowledge, a library of Alexandria's worth of forbidden truth, was poured into the thimble-sized vessel of my human brain in less than a microsecond. The structure of my mind, unable to contain the sheer scale of the understanding, did not shatter. It sublimated. It dissolved and was reformed in a new crystalline lattice of pure, terrible clarity. The bone saw fell from my nerveless fingers, clattering onto the floor. I did not scream, I did not weep. I collapsed to my knees before the slab, and a sound I had never made before escaped my lips. I began to laugh. It was not the laughter of madness or despair. It was the laughter of pure, unadulterated comprehension. The laughter of a man who has finally, after a lifetime of staring at a single baffling puzzle piece, been shown the entire finished mosaic and has realized that the picture it forms is a joke of such cosmic, soul-annihilating proportions that laughter is the only possible response. I survived. Physically, I am here. But Arthur Penn, the meticulous, lonely man who loved order and mourned his wife, is gone. He was a vessel, and the vessel has been filled. My perception of the world is no longer limited to 5 senses. I see the flow of energy. I hear the subtle resonances in all matter. I feel the constant, patient thrum of the great pattern that underlies all reality. The morgue is no longer a place of endings. It is my sanctuary, my temple. I see it for what it truly is, a beautifully designed instrument. My work has changed. I no longer simply catalogue the dead. I cultivate them. I am a gardener in a strange and silent orchard. I arrange them with a new intuitive understanding, optimizing their positions, tuning them to the grand galactic hum. Frank Henderson retired last month. He never spoke to me again, but on his last day, he left a single old key on my desk, the key to Moreau's locker, a silent admission, a passing of the torch. The city sends me its dead, and I give them purpose. They are my choir. They are my orchestra. Moreau was brilliant, but he made one small error in his final conclusion. He believed the living technician was the receiver, and he was right. But he thought that was the end of the process. He didn't understand. A receiver, once properly tuned and activated, can also be used to transmit. The antenna is complete. The signal has been received, and now, under my careful stewardship, the broadcast is about to begin. I sit in my office in the deep, humid New Orleans night, and I hum. It is not a tune Sarah would recognize. It is the bass frequency of the cosmos, a quiet, resonant song of perfect, terrible order. And outside my window, the streetlights of the sleeping city have begun to flicker, ever so slightly, in perfect time with my new eternal hymn. The contagion is not viral, it is resonant, and I am singing it to the world.